Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a stack of sources, defty revenue records, personal journals, official reports, even things like petitions and newspaper articles.
Yeah, and we're diving headfirst into what life was like in the Indian countryside under colonial rule.
Exactly. Our mission here is to really pull out the key insights about how the English East India Company, the EIC, established its Raj, its rule, outside of India's big cities.
And these sources, they're fascinating because they let us see the huge changes colonial rule brought. We'll be looking closely at revenue policies, which sounds dry, but trust me, the consequences were massive.
Right, how people's lives were just fundamentally altered, and also, really importantly, how they didn't just sit back and take it. They resisted.
Absolutely. Resistance is a key theme. We'll see that unfolding as we travel, metaphorically speaking, from early colonial Bengal
To the pretty rugged Rajmahal hills.
and then later into the 19th century to the drier areas of the Bombay Deccan. Different places, different times, different stories.
And we're drawing on some really specific sources, things like the Fifth Report, which went to the British Parliament, the Deccan Riots Report.
And personal accounts, too, like Francis Buchanan's journal, plus those petitions and newspaper snippets you mentioned. You find some, well, genuinely surprising narratives tucked away in these.
Like how old landowning families used these clever legal tricks to hold onto their estates when they were supposed to lose them.
Or the clashes, the real conflicts between completely different ways of life, symbolized by something as basic as a hoe versus a plow.
Yeah, and how something happening thousands of miles away, like the American Civil War, could ripple outwards and end up causing massive debt and even rebellion in rural India. It's all interconnected.
And at the core of all this, there's a really fundamental idea, isn't there? That the laws and policies brought in by a state, they have these huge tangible effects.
Right. They literally decide who gets richer, who gets poorer, who loses their land. Basically, how people manage to survive.
But, and this is so important, people aren't just passively shaped by these laws. They react, they strategize within the new rules, they resist. And by doing that, they actually influence how those laws end up working on the ground.
It's not just top-down control. It's more like a push and pull. Okay, let's get into it. We should probably start in Bengal, right? That's where the EIC really first established its control.
Yes, Bengal was the crucible. After Plassey in the mid-18th century, the company gained significant power there, and they felt they needed to, well, reorder the whole rural setup, land rights, revenue collection, the lot.
And the situation was already pretty dire by the 1770s, wasn't it? The sources talk about famines, agriculture declining.
Exactly. The rural economy was in crisis, and for the EIC, this wasn't just a tragedy, it was a threat to their profits. They needed stability, they needed revenue, they needed agriculture to function smoothly for trade.
So they figured they needed to encourage investment in farming, make the land more productive, secure their income.
That was the thinking. Influenced by ideas back in Britain, they thought if they could just make property rights secure and fix the amount of revenue the state demanded, then landowners would invest in improving their land because, they'd get to keep the extra profits.
Okay, so create a predictable environment and hopefully a class of loyal, wealthy landowners emerges, improves agriculture, and pays taxes reliably. Makes sense on paper.
And this led directly to the permanent settlement in 1793. The name says it all. The plan was to fix the land revenue demand on these big estates permanently, forever.
And who were these landowners they made the deal with?
They dealt primarily with the existing Rajas and Tulagars, the traditional big landholders, but they sort of lumped them together under this new administrative category, Zamindars.
And the Zamindars' role changed.
Fundamentally, they weren't just local bigwigs anymore. Under the permanent settlement, their main job became collecting the state's revenue for their entire estate, which could cover hundreds of villages.
So the company said, you owe us X amount, fixed forever, from this whole area. And the Zamindar had to collect rent from the villagers, pay the company that fixed some, and whatever was left over was theirs to keep.
Precisely. That was the model, a regular, predictable income for the company channeled through these Zamindar intermediaries.
Okay, sounds neat. But the sources suggest it didn't quite work out that way.
Not even close, initially. The huge problem was that Zamindars just kept failing to pay the fixed revenue. The arrears, the unpaid amounts, piled up incredibly fast.
How bad was it?
The figures are startling. Sources suggest over 75%, three-quarters of the Zamindar estates actually changed hands after the settlement came in, usually because the original Zamindar defaulted and the estate was auctioned off.
75% turnover. That's massive disruption. That Birdwan auction in 1797 you mentioned, that's a prime example.
It is. The Raja of Burdwan owed huge amounts, couldn't pay, and his estates went under the hammer. It really highlights the crisis this policy created for many of the established landowning families.
So why? Why were they defaulting so much? What went wrong with the company's grand plan?
Well, there were several key reasons. Let's break them down.
Okay.
First, the initial revenue demand, the amount they fixed permanently, was set really high.
Why so high if it was permanent?
Because the company knew they couldn't increase it later, even if prices went up or more land was farmed. So to make sure they didn't lose out in the long run, they pegged it high right at the start, hoping the burden would lessen over time. But initially, crushing pressure.
Right. Maximize the initial take, figuring it would balance out eventually. Got it.
Exactly. Second problem. The 1790s, when this high demand hit, happened to be a time when prices for agricultural goods were really low, depressed.
Ah, so the peasants, the riots, couldn't get good prices for their crops.
Correct. Which made it hard for them to pay rent to the Zamindar. And if the Zamindar can't collect the rent from below,
They can't pay the company above. A classic squeeze.
a double squeeze, precisely. Then there was the sheer inflexibility of the system. The revenue demand was fixed, yes, but it was also invariable. Didn't matter if you had a flood, a drought, a terrible harvest, the amount was the same.
Wow. No flexibility at all.
None, and it had to be paid punctually. By sunset, on a specific date, this was the infamous sunset law, if the money wasn't in by sunset, bang, your estate could be put up for auction immediately.
The sunset law sounds incredibly harsh. Just
Well-
adds this element of sudden death, financially speaking.
It really does. Constant pressure. And fourth, and this is crucial, the permanent settlement actually undermined the Zamindars' traditional power in other ways, too.
How so?
The company wanted to control them, regulate them, so they disbanded the Zamindars' private militias, they abolished their rights to collect local customs duties, and they brought their local courts, their kutcheries, under the supervision of the company's own official, the collector.
So the Zamindars lost their independent muscle, their local tax revenue, and their control over justice and policing.
Exactly. The collector's office, the collectorate, became this rival center of power right there in the district. There's a telling quote in the source about an official being sent specifically to use the most effectual means to destroy all the influence and the authority of the Raja and his officers when a Raja defaulted. It was deliberate policy.
And just collecting rent from hundreds of villages must have been difficult anyway, even before all this pressure.
Oh, always a challenge. Bad harvests, low prices, that was one side. But the sources also hint that sometimes riots, especially richer ones or village headmen, might deliberately delay paying the Zamindar.
Why would they do that?
Well, maybe they were happy to see the Zamindar struggle. And this brings us to a really interesting dynamic. While the Zamindars were facing all this pressure, another group is actually gaining power at the village level, the Jotedars.
Ah, yes, the Jotedars.
Yeah.
While the old elite struggled, these new players emerged from within the village structure itself.
Precisely. Francis Buchanan's account from Dinajpur in North Bengal gives us a really vivid picture of these figures. By the early 19th century, he observed, these wealthy peasants had amassed considerable power.
How did they do it? What was the basis of their power?
Primarily land. They often held vast tracts, sometimes thousands of acres. But crucially, they also controlled local trade buying and selling produce and acted as moneylenders within the village.
So they had their fingers in many pies: land, trade, credit, giving them huge leverage over the poorer cultivators.
Immense power. And they didn't usually farm all this land themselves. A large portion was cultivated by sharecroppers known as adhires or bargadars. These guys provided their own plows and labor, worked the fields, and then had to hand over half of the produce to the Jotedar.
So the Jotedar is like a village-based landlord, trader, and banker all rolled into one.
A pretty good description. And their power felt much more immediate and effective than the Zamindars, didn't it?
Because they lived in the villages,
Right.
Unlike the Zamindars, who were often based in towns, maybe managing their estates from a distance.
Exactly. The Jotedars were right there, embedded in the local scene, directly controlling the livelihoods of many villagers who depended on them for land or loans. This gave them far more clout on the ground.
Which put them in a prime position to challenge the weakened Zamindars.
Absolutely. And they did. The sources say they fiercely resisted any attempts by the Zamindars to increase the village's overall revenue assessment. the Jama.
How could they resist?
They could literally prevent the Zamindars' officials from even entering the village to collect rent or survey the land. They could mobilize the riots who were dependent on them, and they could deliberately delay paying their dues to the Zamindar, knowing full well that this could tip the Zamindar into defaulting on the company's demand.
That's fascinating. So they actively undermined the Zamindar. And the sources say they often bought up the estates when they were auctioned.
Yes, that's a crucial point. The very policy designed, perhaps, to secure a loyal Zamindar class inadvertently paved the way for this powerful village-level group, the Jotedars, who often ended up acquiring the Zamindars' land.
A classic unintended consequence.
A massive one. And while Buchanan described the Jotedars in North Bengal, similar powerful rich peasant groups were emerging across Bengal called Haladars, Gantidars, Mandals elsewhere. Their rise inevitably chipped away at the traditional authority of the Zamindars.
But the Zamindars didn't just vanish, did they? They fought back, found ways to survive.
They certainly did. The sources make it clear that while their authority was definitely challenged, it didn't just collapse overnight. Faced with losing everything, they got creative. As one source puts it, new contexts produce new strategies. They adapted.
And the most famous strategy was this fictitious sale thing, the Benami transaction.
Yes, Benami purchases were a brilliant, if legally dubious, tactic. The Raja of Burdwan, even though he was massively in arrears, became a master of this. It was a whole series of maneuvers designed to stop the company from actually selling his estate to an outsider.
Okay, walk me through how it worked. It sounds complex.
It was quite clever. First, the Zamindar might transfer some property to a female relative, maybe his mother, because company rules often exempted women's property from being taken for debts.
A loophole right at the start.
Exactly. Then, when the estate was put up for auction because the revenue wasn't paid, the Zamindar's own agents or managers would start bidding.
Bidding on their own boss's property.
Yes. They'd outbid any genuine buyers, they'd win the auction, but then they'd simply refuse to pay the purchase price.
So the sale collapses.
Right. The state officials running the auction would be furious, but legally they'd have to put the estate, or parts of it, up for auction again. And guess what?
Zamindar's agents buy it again and refuse to pay again.
You got it. They'd repeat this cycle over and over. Buy, refuse payment, force a resale. Buy, refuse payment, force another resale. The idea was to completely exhaust the officials and scare off any real bidders who didn't want the hassle.
And eventually,
the state officials, desperate to conclude the sale, might sell the estate back to the original Zamindar or one of his agents or relatives, often for a much lower price than the actual arrears owed.
wow. So the Zamindar avoids paying the full debt, keeps control of the estate, and the company's left short. How widespread was this?
Pretty significant. The source notes that between 1793 and 1801, big zamindaries like Burdwan made Benami purchases worth Rs 30 lakh. And overall, something like 15% of all auction sales during that period might have been these kinds of fictitious deals.
That shows incredible manipulation of the company's own legal system. They were learning how to game it.
Absolutely. It shows their resilience and the resources they still commanded. And resistance wasn't just legal trickery. Sometimes it was physical.
Meaning?
If an outsider, maybe a merchant from the city, did manage to buy an estate at auction, they couldn't always just walk in and take possession. The old Zamindar might still have loyal retainers, strongmen known as lathials, armed with bamboo staffs, who would physically attack the agents of the new owner and drive them off.
So, legal maneuvering backed up by muscle.
Sometimes, yes. And there is another factor, too. The loyalty of the riots themselves.
Loyalty to the Zamindar who was collecting rent from them.
It seems counterintuitive, but the sources suggest the relationship wasn't purely economic exploitation. Sometimes the villagers felt a genuine connection or sense of loyalty to their own Zamindar. He was a figure of authority they knew, perhaps seen as a protector in some ways. They referred to themselves as his proja, his subjects.
So the idea of some unknown outsider taking over the estate could feel like a threat to their own identity or community.
Exactly. It could disturb their sense of belonging and pride, leading them to actively resist the new owners and support the old Zamindar, even if he wasn't always easy to live under. It adds this whole layer of social complexity.
So putting it all together, despite that initial crisis and the 75% turnover figure, many Zamindars did manage to hang on, adapt, and survive using these tactics.
They did. And by the early 19th century, things eased up a bit. The worst of the agricultural price depression was over. The Zamindars who had weathered the storm started to consolidate their positions again. The revenue rules, in practice, maybe became a little less rigid over time. And eventually, many Zamindars managed to strengthen their control over the villages once more, even with the Jotedars still there as rivals.
So the Jotedars didn't just sweep them away immediately.
Not completely, no. The sources suggest the really decisive shift, the final widespread collapse of the old Zamindari power across much of Bengal, didn't happen until much, much later during the Great Depression in the 1930s. That's when the Jotedars really cemented their dominance.
Which means that the famous Ith report, the one submitted to the British Parliament in 1813, might have painted a picture of Zamindar collapse that was, well, a bit exaggerated or premature.
That's exactly the argument modern historians make. And it brings us neatly to the Fifth Report itself. It's such a critical source for this period, but also a tricky one.
Okay, remind us, what exactly was the Fifth Report?
It was one of these massive, detailed reports that the British Parliament kept demanding from the EIC about how they were running things in India. This one, from 1813, is enormous, over 1,000 pages.
1,000 pages. What's in it?
About 800 pages are appendices. And they are gold mines for historians. You find petitions from Zamindars and riots complaining about the system, detailed reports from the district collectors describing what was happening on the ground, statistics on revenue collection, notes on how Bengal and Madras were being administered. It's a huge compilation of official documents and data from the time.
Why was Parliament demanding such incredibly detailed reports in the early 1800s? What was going on back in Britain?
Well, ever since the EIC got major political power in Bengal back in the 1760s, its activities were under constant scrutiny in London. There was a lot of opposition to the company's monopoly on trade. Other British merchants and industrialists wanted a piece of the Indian market.
So rival economic interests were pushing for oversight.
Definitely. Plus, there were political groups arguing that the company's conquests only benefited the company's shareholders, not the British nation. And stories about corruption and misrule by company officials were widely publicized, fueling criticism.
So Parliament stepped in to regulate.
Yes, they passed various acts to try and control the EIC, and demanding these detailed reports was part of that effort, gathering information, holding them accountable. The Fifth Report came out of a special select committee set up for this purpose, and it became the basis for some really intense debates in Parliament about the future of British rule in India.
Okay, so it's incredibly valuable as a collection of evidence, but, and here's the historian's caveat, we have to be careful how we read it, right?
Absolutely crucial. The Fifth Report basically shaped how people understood rural Bengal for over 150 years. The evidence inside it, the petitions, the stats is invaluable. We couldn't do without it. But we have to constantly ask, who wrote this report and why? What was their agenda?
What do you mean, why? What agenda might it have had?
Well, recent research, looking beyond just the official EIC records using things like Zamindar family archives, local village records suggests the Fifth Report might have been pushing a particular narrative.
Which was?
The committee that produced it was known to be critical of the EIC's administration. So the argument goes, they might have deliberately exaggerated the extent to which the traditional Zamindari system had collapsed, the amount of land changing hands, the chaos.
To make the EIC look bad, to support their argument that the company was mismanaging Bengal.
That's the potential bias. They might have selectively highlighted the failures and the turmoil because, as we saw with the Banami sales and the Lathiels and the ryotwari, the Zamindars were often much more resilient and resourceful than the report sometimes implies. They weren't always displaced, precisely because they found these ingenious ways to survive.
So the Fifth Report is essential, but we need to triangulate. Compare it with other non-official sources to get a fuller, maybe less crisis-driven picture.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of why you can never rely on just one source, especially an official one produced in a context of political debate. You always need to dig deeper and look for other perspectives.
That's a really important point about historical method. Okay, fascinating stuff on Bengal. Let's shift our focus now. We're leaving the settled agriculture of the Bengal plains and heading west into the hills.
Yes, we're moving to the Rajmahal Hills area. It's a different landscape, drier, more rugged, and we're looking at a different kind of story. The conflict that arose when the frontier of settled plough-based agriculture, pushed by the British, started expanding into lands used by people who lived very differently.
And Francis Buchanan, our source-providing surveyor, traveled through here too, didn't he? In the early 19th century.
He did, around 1810, 1811. And his journal entries really capture that outsider's perspective. He talks about the hills being impenetrable, dangerous, a place few outsiders dared to go. The local people he met, the Paharias, seemed hostile, wary of officials like him. Sometimes they'd just abandon their villages when he showed up.
So who are these Paharias? How did they live?
Records from the late 18th century identify them as the inhabitants of the Rajmahal Hills region. Their entire existence was deeply tied to the forest. They lived off forest produce and they practiced shifting cultivation.
Shifting cultivation.
Yes, often called hoe cultivation because the hoe, not the plow, was their main farming tool.
Right, the hoe, not the plow. That's a key distinction.
It really is. They'd clear a patch of forest-cut bushes, burn the undergrowth, use the ash as fertilizer. Then they'd just lightly scratch the surface with hoes and plant crops like pulses and millets. After a few years, when the soil's fertility dipped, they'd leave that patch fallow to recover naturally and move on to clear a new patch somewhere else.
So their whole way of life depended on having access to large areas of forest and the freedom to move around within it.
Absolutely. Mobility and forest access were everything. Besides the small-scale farming, they gathered mawa flowers for food, silk cocoons and resin to sell, wood for making charcoal. The forest undergrowth and the fallow lands provided pasture for their animals too. The sources paint a picture of an intimate connection. They were hunters, shifting cultivators, food gatherers, charcoal producers, silkworm rearers.
Sounds like their identity, their culture, their survival, it was all completely interwoven with that forest environment.
Deeply interwoven. They saw the whole Rajmahal region as their land, the foundation of their identity, and they were known to fiercely resist outsiders encroaching on it. They had chiefs who maintained unity, settled disputes, and led them in conflicts, whether with other hill tribes or with settled peoples down on the plains.
But they did interact with the plains people. They weren't totally isolated.
No, not totally. It was a complex relationship. It included raiding settled villages on the plains. The sources suggest this was sometimes driven by necessity, when forest resources were scarce, but it was also a way for them to assert their power and, maybe, negotiate their relationship with the settled world.
Negotiate. How?
Well, Zamindars on the plains often paid the Paharias a kind of regular tribute, almost like protection money, to buy peace and stop the raids. Traders who needed to use the hill passes controlled by the Paharias also had to pay tolls. Once the toll was paid, the Paharia chiefs would guarantee the trader's safety. So it was this mix of raiding, tribute, tolls, a kind of tense coexistence.
But this delicate balance started to break down towards the end of the 18th century.
Yes, precisely when the frontiers of settled agriculture began expanding aggressively into the region. The British colonial state was actively encouraging forest clearance. They saw forests as unproductive wasteland that needed to be turned into taxable farmland.
And the Zamindars and Jotedars from the plains were happy to oblige, turning uncultivated lands into rice fields.
Exactly. And the British view of forests and the people living in them was starkly different from the Paharias' perspective.
How did the British see them?
They tended to associate forests with, wildness, savagery, lack of control. Forest people like the Paharias were seen as primitive, unruly, difficult to govern. There was this strong belief, rooted in European ideas of progress, that forests had to be cleared, settled agriculture using the plow had to be established, and forest peoples needed to be tamed, civilized, basically forced or persuaded to give up their traditional ways and adopt settled farming. Buchanan's own writings reflect this attitude very clearly.
So as the farms pushed outwards, the Paharias' forests and pastures started shrinking.
Critically shrinking, which directly threatened their shifting cultivation, their hunting, their gathering, their entire livelihood. Predictably, the conflict intensified. Paharia raids on settled villages became more frequent and desperate. Driven by the need for food and resources, colonial officials struggled to control them.
What was the initial British military response in the 1770s? It sounds pretty grim in the sources.
It was brutal. They adopted a policy of extermination, just outright hunting down and killing Paharias.
Extermination. That's stark language.
It is, and it shows the level of violence the state was prepared to use. But even that didn't fully subdue the Paharias. So in the 1780s, a collector named Augustus Cleveland tried a different tactic: pacification.
Pacification, what did that involve? Paying them off.
Essentially, yes. Cleveland offered the Paharia chiefs an annual allowance, a stipend. In return, the chiefs were supposed to control their own people, maintain order, basically act as policemen for the company within their own communities.
Trying to co-opt the leadership. How did that go down with the Paharias?
It was divisive and often counterproductive. Many chiefs flat out refused the allowance, and those who did accept it often lost authority and respect among their own people. They were seen as having sold out, become puppets, or paid employees of the colonial government rather than independent leaders.
And the ones who refused or felt alienated?
They tended to withdraw further into the hills, trying to insulate themselves from British influence and continue their resistance against outsiders. This whole history, the brutal hunts, the failed pacification, explains why Buchanan encountered such deep suspicion when he arrived around 1810.
Right. They'd learned from bitter experience that any agent of the Sarkar, the government, likely represented a threat to their way of life, their control over their lands.
Exactly. Every white man potentially symbolized the power that was destroying their world. And by the time Buchanan got there, there was another group arriving on the scene, adding a new layer of threat for the Paharias. The Santhals.
The Santhals, okay, who were they?
The sources talk about the Santhals pouring into the area around this time, representing newer intimations of danger for the Paharias. And crucially, the Santhals did things differently. They were clearing forests, yes, cutting timber, but they were using the plough. They were settling down, growing rice and cotton.
A plough again. The symbol of settled agriculture that the British favored.
Precisely. As the Santhals moved into the lower hills and the fringes of the forests, they effectively displaced the Paharias, pushing them further back, deeper into the Rajmahal range. It became this direct contest, this battle between the hoe and the plough, as the source puts it, a clash of livelihoods acted out on the landscape.
Where did the Santhals come from originally?
They'd started migrating into Bengal maybe around the 1780s. Zamindars often hired them specifically because they had a reputation as hardworking cultivators and expert forest clearers, perfect for reclaiming land and expanding agriculture.
And the British officials saw them as useful, especially compared to the Paharias.
Very useful. Remember, the British had failed to tame the Paharias, who clung to their hoe cultivation, resisted cutting down forests on a large scale, and remained, from the British perspective, turbulent and uncontrollable. The Santhals, on the other hand, seemed like the ideal settlers.
Because they were willing to clear forests and, crucially, adopt plough agriculture.
Exactly. They seemed ready to become the settled, revenue-paying peasants the British wanted. So the colonial state actively encouraged them to settle in the Rajmahal foothills.
And this led to the creation of a specific territory for them.
Yes, the Dominico, established in 1832, a large tract of land in the foothills, was formally demarcated and declared to be the land of the Santhals. The name means skirt of the hills.
What were the rules for living in the Dominico?
They had to live within its boundaries, they had to practice plough agriculture, and they had to become settled peasants. There was even a specific target. At least 1/10 of the domain area had to be cleared and cultivated within the first 10 years. It was all very planned, surveyed, mapped, marked out with boundary pillars to separate it from the plains and from the Paharia areas higher up.
And did the Santhals settle there in large numbers?
Incredibly quickly. The growth was explosive. The sources show it going from just 40 Santhal villages in 1838 to nearly 1,500 villages by 1851. The population jumped from about 3,000 to over 82,000 in that same short period.
That's staggering growth. Migration and settlement on a huge scale. And presumably, more cultivated land meant more revenue for the company.
Oh, definitely. That was a major motivation. For the Santhals themselves, their own traditions and myths often talk about a long history of wandering, searching for a permanent home. So the Dominico, this land promised to them, must have initially seemed like the end of that long journey, a place to finally put down roots.
But what happened to the Paharias who were already living in or using those foothills?
The impact on them was devastating. They resisted the Santhal influx, but they were pushed back, confined to the drier, rockier, less fertile upper hills. Their whole way of life was crippled. Shifting cultivation needs space. It needs access to fertile land for rotation. That land was now mostly inside the daemon, off limits. Their farming became unsustainable. Hunting also got harder as the forests were cleared. They became increasingly impoverished.
So the Santhals settled, started farming commercially, growing cotton for the market, dealing with traders, moneylenders.
Yes, they transitioned from mobility and subsistence toward settled agriculture, integrated into the market economy. But this very integration soon created a whole new set of problems for the Santhals.
What kinds of problems? They had their own land, didn't they?
They did, initially, but they found that the land they'd cleared and worked so hard was slipping away. The colonial state imposed heavy taxes on it. And they fell into the clutches of moneylenders, the Decans, as they called these outsiders, who charged crippling interest rates.
Decans meaning outsiders, right?
Yes, moneylenders and traders who weren't Santhal. When Santhals couldn't repay debts, the Decans would seize their land. On top of that, Zamindars from the plains started trying to assert their own authority and collect rents inside the Dominico, which was supposed to be Santhal land.
So the Santhals, brought in to be ideal settlers, ended up facing the same old pressures. High taxes, debt traps, loss of land, interference from Zamindars.
Exactly the same cycle. They felt trapped and exploited by the state, the moneylenders, the Zamindars. By the mid-1850s, the simmering resentment just boiled over.
Into the Santhal Rebellion of 1855-56.
That's right. The sources tell us the Santhals felt it was time to rise up against all these forces, Zamindars, moneylenders, and the colonial state that seemed to back them up. They wanted to create their own ideal world, a realm where they would rule themselves, free from exploitation.
The rebellion was eventually put down, wasn't it, militarily?
It was, and very brutally. But the sheer scale and fierceness of the uprising clearly shocked the British. As a direct consequence, and maybe to prevent future rebellions, they created the Santhal Pargana,
What was that?
a new administrative district carved out of existing districts like Bhagalpur and Birbhum. It covered about 5,500 square miles and was given some special laws and administrative structures, supposedly to protect Santhal interests and conciliate them.
So their resistance, even though crushed, actually forced the colonial state to change its administrative map and policies.
It's a powerful example of how rebellion, even in defeat, can have tangible consequences, forcing the ruling power to adapt. And the sources also show how the rebellion dramatically changed how the British saw the Santhals.
How did perceptions change?
It's visible in the illustrations from the time. Before the revolt, you often see images depicting Santhal villages as idyllic, peaceful, orderly. After the rebellion, illustrations published back in Britain suddenly showed Santhals engaged in violent and savage deeds.
Propaganda, basically.
Very much so. Images of fighting, burning villages, Santhal prisoners in chains being led away by triumphant British soldiers. These were designed to shape public opinion in Britain, justify the suppression, and reinforce the image of the civilizing mission against supposed savagery.
Which just underscores again how important it is to be critical of our sources, even visual ones. And that includes Buchanan's journals, which we've relied on quite a bit for this section.
Absolutely. We've used his descriptions of the Paharias and Santhals, but just like the fifth report, we need to remember who he was and why he was there.
He was an EIC employee. His trip wasn't a holiday.
Not at all. His journeys were sponsored, funded by the company, specifically to gather information they wanted. He traveled with a large entourage. When he showed up in a village, people didn't see a neutral observer. They saw an agent of the Sarkar, the government.
What kind of information was the company after? Why fund these extensive surveys?
As the EIC's power grew, so did its commercial ambitions. They were constantly looking for natural resources they could control and exploit. So they funded surveys of landscapes, investigations into revenue sources. They sent out scientists, geologists, botanists, doctors to collect detailed information. Buchanan was a particularly meticulous observer in this larger project.
And what did he focus on? What caught his eye?
His journals are obsessive about geology, rocks, stones, soil types, minerals like iron ore, mica, granite, saltpeter. He carefully recorded local techniques for things like making salt or mining iron ore. He was looking for anything with potential commercial value.
And how did he describe the landscape itself?
This is really telling. He didn't just describe what he saw, he constantly evaluated it based on how it could be transformed to become more productive in the company's eyes. He'd note what crops should be grown here, what trees needed cutting down, what should be planted instead.
So his whole perspective was filtered through the company's commercial needs and Western ideas about progress and productive land use.
Completely. He was inherently critical of lifestyles like the Paharias. He believed forests were inherently less valuable than agricultural land and needed to be converted. Source 5 gives a clear example where he's advocating replacing woods with plantations or clearing them for farming. His vision for the land was fundamentally different from that of the people actually living there.
A really vital context to keep in mind when reading his accounts. Even seemingly factual descriptions carry embedded assumptions and agendas.
It always comes back to reading critically, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, we've covered Bengal, the Rajmahal Hills. Let's make our final stop in this deep dive. The Bombay Deccan, Western India. We're looking at a later period here, the mid to late 19th century, and a different kind of rural crisis, a major peasant revolt fueled by debt.
Studying revolts like this one is so important for historians. When people rebel, they express their anger, their sense of injustice. Understanding why they were so angry gives us a rare window into the lives and suffering of ordinary people who often don't leave many written records themselves.
And the revolt itself generates records, right? The government investigate.
Exactly. The authorities have to investigate. They need to understand the causes to restore order, maybe change policies to stop it happening again. So, paradoxically, the revolt produces documents, commission reports, police records, testimonies that historians can then use.
Like the Deccan Revolt of 1875.
A classic case. Peasant uprisings against moneylenders and grain dealers happened in various parts of India in the 19th century. This one kicked off in Supa, a large village in Pune district. Supa was a market town, lots of shopkeepers and moneylenders, sahukars they were called.
And what happened there?
On May 12, 1875, riots peasants from the villages around Supa gathered. They went straight for the sahukars. They attacked their shops and houses, but their main demand was for the account books, the bahikatas, and the debt bonds.
They specifically wanted the documents recording their debts. That's key, not just looting.
Absolutely key. They seized the katas and bonds and burned them. They did loot grain shops too, and sometimes set fire to the sahukars' houses, but the destruction of the debt records was central.
And it spread from Supa.
Very quickly. From Pune district, it moved into neighboring Ahmednagar and eventually covered a huge area, over 6,500 square kilometers. More than 30 villages were affected, all within about 2 months. And the pattern was consistent. Attack the sahukars, burn the account books, destroy the debt bonds. The sahukars were terrified. Many fled their villages entirely.
This must have set off alarm bells for the British. 1857 wasn't that long ago.
Huge alarm bells. The source mentions they saw the specter of 1857. They reacted fast, police reinforcements, troops deployed. Hundreds were arrested, 951, according to the source, many convicted. It took several months to fully suppress the unrest.
There's a newspaper account mentioned, Native Opinion, from 1876. What did it say?
It described the revolt as being quite organized. Apparently, the riots posted lookouts, spies, to warn if officials were coming. When the coast was clear, they'd gather quickly, confront the moneylenders, demand the documents under threat, get what they came for, and then disperse just as quickly before the authorities could catch them in the act. It suggests coordinated action, not just spontaneous rioting.
So what drove this widespread, targeted anger against the moneylenders? It clearly wasn't just about being in debt, was it? Debt wasn't new.
No, it ran much deeper than that. Indebtedness was chronic. The fury stemmed from a whole history of changes under colonial rule and a powerful sense among the riots that they were being fundamentally cheated, that the moneylenders were exploiting them unjustly, breaking old rules and twisting the new laws.
What were the key changes under colonial rule that led to this?
A big one was the revenue system they introduced in this part of India, the ryotwari settlement. Remember the permanent settlement in Bengal? Well, the British rarely extended that system to territories they conquered later, after about 1810.
Why not? Why ditch the permanent settlement?
2 main reasons, really. First, economics. After 1810, agricultural prices generally started rising. In Bengal, because the revenue was fixed forever, the company couldn't get any share of that increased value. All the extra profit went to the Zamindars. In new territories like the Deccan, the company wanted to be able to increase the revenue demand periodically to capture a share of rising agricultural wealth. So they preferred temporary settlements.
Okay, keep the revenue flexible so the state could benefit from economic growth. What was the second reason?
Ideas. By the 1820s, British officials were reading economists like David Ricardo.
Ricardo, the famous classical economist. How did his ideas influence Indian land tax?
Ricardo had theories about land rent. He argued that a landowner was really only entitled to the average rent value of the land. Any profit above that average rent he called economic rent or surplus, and he argued this surplus should ideally be taxed by the state. If it wasn't taxed, landowners might just become lazy rentiers, living off the surplus without actually investing it productively back into the land.
And the British officials looked at the Bengal Zamindars getting richer as prices rose without the state getting a cut and thought, rentiers. Ricardo was right.
Pretty much. They saw the Bengal system as potentially creating unproductive rentiers, and they wanted a different system in the Deccan that would allow the state to tax that potential surplus.
So instead of settling with Zamindars, they created the ryotwari system. How did that work?
Ryotwari meant the revenue settlement was made directly with the individual peasant cultivator, the ryot. No intermediary zamindar. The state officials assessed each field, estimated its average income based on soil type and other factors, and then fixed a proportion of that estimated income as the government's revenue share.
Directly taxing the peasant. But crucially, this demand wasn't permanent, unlike in Bengal.
No, that's the key difference. The settlement was temporary, the lands were supposed to be resurveyed every 30 years or so, and the revenue rates could be and usually were increased.
How did this ryotwari system work out for the Deccan peasants when it was first introduced?
The first settlements in the 1820s were notoriously harsh. The revenue demand was set extremely high, so high, in fact, that the sources say in many areas, peasants simply abandoned their villages because they couldn't possibly pay. It was especially tough in areas with poor soil or very unreliable rainfall, where crop yields could vary wildly year to year.
And the company collectors were strict about collecting this high demand.
Absolutely. The state wanted its money. Collectors were known to extract payment with utmost severity, seizing crops, imposing fines on whole villages if individuals defaulted. They were establishing the system, and they enforced it rigidly.
And then things got even worse in the 1830s.
They did. First, agricultural prices collapsed after 1832 and stayed low for maybe 15 years. So peasant incomes plummeted just when they were facing these high demands. And then, on top of that, a terrible famine hit between 1832 and 1834.
The source mentions devastating losses, a third of the cattle, maybe half the human population in some parts.
Catastrophic. It wiped out reserves, left survivors destitute, unpaid revenue arrears just mounted sky high. So you have this crushing state demand, falling incomes, famine. How do people even survive, let alone pay taxes, buy seeds for the next year, feed their families?
There's only one answer, isn't there? They had to borrow from the moneylender.
Inevitably. The sources are explicit. Revenue could rarely be paid without taking a loan from a sahukar. And once you took that first loan under such desperate circumstances, it was incredibly hard to get out. Paying back the principal was tough enough. Paying the accumulating interest was often impossible.
So dependence on moneylenders became structural, not just for emergencies, but for basic survival and meeting the state's demand.
Exactly. People needed loans for everyday needs, for production costs like seeds and tools, for social obligations like marriages. By the 1840s, officials themselves were sounding the alarm about the staggering levels of peasant debt across the Deccan. The system had pushed them into it.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster. Did things ever improve?
There was a bit of a recovery in the mid-1840s. Prices began to pick up. Officials also started to realize, perhaps, that the initial 1820 settlements had been way too harsh, too rigid, and had nearly caused total economic collapse. So they moderated the revenue demands slightly, hoping to encourage people to expand cultivation again.
And did cultivation expand?
Yes, with prices rising after 1845, peasants did start expanding their acreage, clearing new land, turning pasture into fields.
Okay, so maybe things were looking up.
In a way, but here's the catch. Expanding cultivation costs money. You need more plows, more bullocks, more seeds, maybe access to more land. Where do peasants get that capital?
Back to the moneylender.
Back to the moneylender. So even a period of agricultural expansion could paradoxically lead to deeper indebtedness for many riots. And then, into this already fragile situation, comes this massive external shock, the American Civil War.
Right. This seems so random. How does a war in America cause chaos in the Deccan?
It's all about cotton. Britain's textile industry in the mid-19th century was utterly dependent on raw cotton from the American South. About 3/4 of their supply came from there before the 1860s. British manufacturers were nervous about this reliance.
They were looking for alternative sources.
Exactly. They formed groups like the Cotton Supply Association, the Manchester Cotton Company, specifically to promote cotton growing elsewhere. And India, with its climate, soil, and cheap labor, looked like a prime candidate.
So when the American Civil War started in 1861 and blockades stopped southern cotton exports,
Panic stations in Manchester. American cotton exports to Britain basically vanished overnight. The numbers are incredible, from over 2 million bales in 1861 down to just 55,000 in 1862, less than 3% of normal supply.
a total supply shock.
Massive. So frantic messages went out to India. Grow more cotton, export more cotton. Merchants from Bombay rushed into the Deccan cotton districts, offering money, guaranteeing purchase, urging peasants to plant cotton.
And prices for Indian cotton must have shot up.
Through the roof. Suddenly, there was this huge global demand. Export merchants in Bombay were desperate to get their hands on Indian cotton and were willing to pour money into the countryside to secure it.
How did that money reach the peasants?
It flowed through the existing credit networks. Export merchants gave large advances to the big urban sahukars, who then passed the credit down to the local village moneylenders. And these village moneylenders, suddenly flush with cash and super confident they'd get repaid because cotton prices were so high, started offering credit very freely to the riots.
So for a few years during the American War, Deccan peasants had easy access to loans.
Seemingly limitless access, according to the sources. They could get advances like Rs 100 per acre just for planting cotton. Money lenders were happy to give long-term loans, encouraging a massive expansion of cotton cultivation.
And cotton farming boomed in the Deccan.
It doubled in acreage between 1860 and 1864. By 1862, India was supplying something like 90% of Britain's total cotton imports. On the surface, it looked like a golden age for Deccan agriculture.
But was it prosperity for everyone?
Not really. Some richer peasants certainly did well out of it. But for the vast majority, this rapid expansion, fueled by all that easy credit, just meant they took on even more debt, gambling that the high prices would continue forever.
But the American Civil War ended in 1865.
It did. And American cotton production recovered remarkably quickly. Indian cotton exports to Britain plummeted just as fast as they had risen. The artificial wartime demand evaporated.
And the easy credit disappeared too.
Instantly. The export merchants and big sahookers in Bombay slammed the brakes on. They saw demand collapse, prices tumble. They stopped sending advances into the countryside, restricted credit, and crucially, started demanding repayment of all the money they'd previously lent out. The village moneylenders, squeezed from above, turned to the riots and demanded their money back.
So the peasants are facing collapsing cotton prices, vanishing credit, and demands for repayment of huge debts taken on during the boom. And right at that moment,
the 30-year revenue settlement period was up. It was time for the government to revise the land revenue demand under the ryotwari system.
And did they revise it downwards, given the circumstances?
Quite the opposite. The state revised the demand upwards, dramatically. Increases of 50 to 100% were common.
Wow. That's brutal timing. An enormous tax hike hitting precisely when their main cash crop income had collapsed and the credit system had seized up.
It was the perfect storm, an impossible situation for most riots. How on earth could they pay this hugely inflated government demand with cotton prices in the basement and no way to borrow? Their only option was to try, once again, to get a loan from the moneylender, not for expansion now, but just to pay the taxman and survive.
But the moneylenders weren't lending anymore.
They refused. They'd lost all confidence in the riot's ability to repay anything now the cotton boom was over. They demanded repayment of old debts, wouldn't issue new loans. It was a complete credit crunch at the worst possible time.
Okay, so that explains the desperation. But the revolt targeted the moneylenders with such specific anger, burning the books, the bonds. It wasn't just about the lack of credit, was it? It was about feeling cheated.
This is absolutely central. The anger wasn't just about being poor or indebted. It was fueled by a deep sense of injustice, a feeling that the moneylenders were behaving unfairly, insensitively, and crucially, violating long-standing customary norms about how money lending should work.
There were customary norms.
Yeah.
Unwritten rules.
Yes. Money lending wasn't new. Sahookers had always been powerful figures. But traditionally, there were certain informal understandings, customs, meant to regulate the relationship and limit exploitation. One key principle mentioned in the sources was that the total interest charged should never exceed the original principal amount borrowed. It was called the Damdupat rule in some areas, a way to stop debt spiraling infinitely.
And the riots felt these norms were breaking down under colonial rule.
That's what the sources strongly suggest. The Deccan Riots Commission itself documented cases that shocked officials, like a tiny Rs 100 loan where the interest somehow ballooned to over Rs 2,000. Riot petitions are full of complaints about this kind of thing, violations of custom, unjust, and exorbitant demands.
So they didn't just see the moneylenders as creditors, but as cheats, actively manipulating the system.
Exactly. Devious, deceitful, those are the kinds of words used. They felt the Sahookers were twisting the new colonial laws and forging accounts to entrap them. There's a great example with the Limitation Law of 1859.
What was that law?
It said that a loan bond was only legally valid for 3 years. The intention might have been benign, maybe to stop interest accumulating forever by forcing the lender to go to court within 3 years if they wanted to recover the debt.
Sounds like it should have protected the borrower, limiting the lifespan of a debt bond.
You'd think so. But the moneylenders turned it completely on its head. What they did was force the riot to sign a brand new bond every 3 years, just before the old one expired.
Okay, so what's the catch?
The catch was what they wrote on the new bond. They took the original loan amount, added all the unpaid interest that had accumulated over the 3 years, and wrote that total sum down as the new principal amount for the new bond.
Whoa. So the interest got rolled into the principal, and then they charged interest on the interest.
Precisely. Compound interest on steroids, achieved by manipulating the very law designed, perhaps, to prevent it. Source 10 has a riots petition explaining exactly how this worked, showing how a debt could just explode exponentially. Riots also complain about other tricks. Sahukars refusing to give receipts when payments were made, writing fictional amounts in the ledgers, forcing riots to sell their harvest to them at rock-bottom prices, and ultimately using the courts to seize their land, their tools, everything.
And those written documents, the bonds, the deeds, became the symbols of this whole oppressive system.
They absolutely did. In the past, many transactions might have been based more on verbal agreements, on trust within the community, but the British system demanded legally enforceable written contracts for everything. They were suspicious of informal deals.
But most peasants were illiterate, weren't they? They wouldn't know what they were signing.
That was a huge part of the power imbalance. They'd be forced to put their thumbprint on documents filled with complex clauses they couldn't read. The source says they feared the written word, but what choice did they have? They needed the loans to survive, to pay the revenue. And the moneylenders, backed by the colonial legal system, demanded the bonds.
That deed of hire example in Source 9 is chilling. A peasant signs away his own bullocks and cart, then has to rent them back.
It perfectly illustrates how the legal formalities, combined with economic desperation, could be used to strip people of their assets, turning them into tenants on their own land, using their own tools, but now owned by the moneylender. It's the culmination of all those pressures, the revenue system, the debt cycle, the boom and bust, the manipulation of the law that finally exploded in 1875.
And the burning of the account books makes perfect sense in that context. It was a direct assault on the instruments of that perceived injustice, wiping the slate clean, literally.
Exactly. Destroying the evidence of debt, the symbols of their oppression.
Okay, so after the revolt was suppressed, the government felt compelled to investigate properly.
Yes, the Bombay government was initially a bit dismissive, but the central government of India, nervous about echoes of 1857, pushed them hard to figure out what had gone wrong.
Which led to the Deccan Riots Commission.
It did. Their report, presented to Parliament in 1878, is another one of those major official sources, like the Fifth Report, that historians rely on heavily for understanding this period. It's packed with information.
What kind of information did the commission gather?
They went deep. They held inquiries across the affected districts, took statements from everyone involved, riots, sahukars, local officials, eyewitnesses. They compiled masses of data. Revenue rates over time, price fluctuations, interest rate patterns, land transfer statistics. They gathered reports from the collectors. It's an incredibly rich resource.
Same caveat as before. Read critically.
Always, especially with official reports produced after a major crisis. It's invaluable evidence, yes, but remember its purpose and context. The commission was explicitly asked to determine if the government's own revenue demand had been a major cause of the revolt.
And what was their official conclusion?
They concluded that, no, the primary blame lay with the moneylenders and their practices, not with the government's revenue policies.
Ah, convenient for the government.
Well, yes. While there was certainly evidence of moneylender exploitation, as we've discussed, this conclusion neatly sidesteps the role of the high and inflexible revenue demand in creating the conditions for that exploitation in the first place. It shows that typical reluctance of colonial governments to admit their own policies might be the root cause of popular unrest.
So the report gives us the raw data, the testimonies, but the official interpretation needs to be taken with a grain of salt. We need to look at the evidence ourselves and compare it with other sources.
Precisely. Use the invaluable information in the report, but question the official framing. Juxtapose it with things like that newspaper account, which hinted at organization or legal records or any other scraps of evidence that offered different perspectives.
It really drives home the point we saw with the Fifth Report. Too valuable data, potentially biased framing. You need multiple angles.
Exactly. The critique of the Fifth Report, suggesting it exaggerated Zamindar collapse to bash the EIC, comes from comparing it with local records, Zamindar archives. You need that cross-referencing to get a more nuanced picture than any single official report can give you.
Okay, so we've journeyed through Bengal's permanent settlement, the Rajmahal Hills conflict, the Deccan crisis, and revolt. Bringing it all together, what are the main things we've learned about how colonial rule changed the Indian countryside?
I think the first big takeaway is just how profoundly disruptive colonial policies, especially those new revenue systems, were. The permanent settlement, the ryotwari system, they weren't just administrative tweaks. They fundamentally reordered society, created new winners and losers like the Jotedars versus the Zamindars, and often had completely unintended consequences that caused immense hardship and instability.
And we saw how the colonial state often imposed these systems based on theories developed back in Britain, like Ricardo's rent theory, or driven by commercial interests, like Buchanan's view of forests, without maybe fully grasping the complex realities on the ground.
Absolutely. There was often a disconnect. We also saw how colonial expansion directly fueled conflict between different ways of life, like the Paharias and the Santhals, the hoe versus the plough, and how the state sometimes manipulated these situations for its own strategic or economic advantage.
And the connections to the wider world were stark, weren't they? How something like the American Civil War could trigger a cotton boom, flood the Deccan with credit, and then lead to a devastating bust and revolt when it ended. Global economics reaching right down into the village.
A powerful example of that interconnection. But maybe the most crucial takeaway is that people weren't just passive victims. We saw constant resistance, adaptation, manipulation.
Right, from the Zamindars' clever Benami sales
To the Jotedars deliberately delaying payments.
to the outright organized revolts of the Santhals and the Deccan Riots. People found ways to push back, to survive, to assert their interests within the new system.
And sometimes, as with the creation of the Santhal Pargana, that resistance, even if initially crushed, forced the state to actually change course, to make concessions. Agency matters.
And finally, underlying all of this is the need for us, looking back, to be really critical about our sources, to understand who produced them, why, what biases they might contain, and to always seek out multiple perspectives, especially those outside the official narrative.
Couldn't agree more. That critical engagement with the evidence is what allows us to piece together these complex stories.
It really highlights the intricate dance between state power, economic forces, local societies, and individual actions in shaping history. So thinking about all that, how policies, economic shifts, competing perspectives created such turmoil and change back then, makes you wonder, doesn't it? How might similar forces be shaping our own communities, our own world today?
What are the modern equivalents of the permanent settlement or the cotton boom? Whose perspectives are driving policy? Who is resisting and how?
Definitely some food for thought there. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you for joining us.